6. The whole and its parts. In desiring machines, everything functions at the same time, but amid hiatuses and ruptures, breakdowns and failures, stalling and short circuits, distances and fragmentations, within a sum that never succeeds in bringing its various parts together so as to form a whole. That is because the breaks in the process are productive and are reassemblies in and of themselves. Disjunctions, by the very fact that they are disjunctions, are inclusive. Even consumptions are transitions, processes of becoming and returns. Maurice Blanchot has found a way to pose the problem in the most rigorous terms at the level of the literary machine. How to produce, how to think about fragments whose sole relationship is sheer difference. Fragments that are related to one another only in that each of them is different, without having recourse either to any sort of original totality, not even one that has been lost, or to a subsequent totality that may not yet have come about. It is only the category of multiplicity, used as a substantive and going beyond both the one and the many, beyond the predicative relation of the one and the many, that can account for desiring production. Desiring production is pure multiplicity, that is to say, an affirmation that is irreducible to any sort of unity. We live today in the age of partial objects, bricks that have been shattered to bits and leftovers. We no longer believe in the myth of the existence of fragments that, like pieces of an antique statue, are merely waiting for the last one to be turned up, so that they may all be glued back together to create a unity that is precisely the same as the original unity. We no longer believe in a primordial totality that once existed, or in a final totality that awaits us at some future date. We no longer believe in the dull grey outlines of a dreary, colourless dialectic of evolution aimed at forming a harmonious whole out of heterogeneous bits by rounding off their rough edges. We believe only in totalities that are peripheral. And if we discover such a totality alongside various separate parts, it is a whole of these particular parts, but does not totalize them. It is a unity of all of these particular parts, but does not unify them. Rather, it is added to them as a new part, fabricated separately. It comes into being, but applying this time to the whole as some inspired fragment composed separately. So Proust writes of the unity of Balzac's creation, though his remark is also an apt description of his own oeuvre. In the literary machine that Proust's In Search of Lost Time constitutes, we are struck by the fact that all the parts are produced as asymmetrical sections, paths that suddenly come to an end, hermetically sealed boxes, non-communicating vessels, watertight compartments, in which there are gaps even between things that are contiguous, gaps that are affirmations, pieces of a puzzle belonging not to any one puzzle, but to many, pieces assembled by forcing them into a certain place where they may or may not belong, their unmatched edges violently bent out of shape, forcibly made to fit together, to interlock, with a number of pieces always left over. It is a schizoid work par excellence. It is almost as though the author's guilt, his confessions of guilt, are merely a sort of joke. In Kleinian terms, it might be said that the depressive position is only a cover-up for a more deeply rooted schizoid attitude. For the rigors of the law are only an apparent expression of the protest of the one, whereas their real object is the absolution of fragmented universes, in which the law never unites anything in a single whole, but, on the contrary, measures and maps out the divergences, the dispersions, the exploding into fragments of something that is innocent precisely because its source is madness. This is why, in Proust's work, the apparent theme of guilt is tightly interwoven with a completely different theme totally contradicting it, the plant-like innocence that results from the total compartmentalization of the sexes, both in Charlu's Encounters and in Albertine's Slumber, where flowers blossom in profusion and the utter innocence of madness is revealed, whether it be the patent madness of Charlu or the supposed madness of Albertine. Hence, Proust maintained that the whole itself is a product, produced as nothing more than a part alongside other parts, which it neither unifies nor totalizes, though it has an effect on these other parts, simply because it establishes aberrant paths of communication between non-communicating vessels, transverse unities between elements that retain all their difference within their own particular boundaries. Thus, in the trip on the train, in Search of Lost Time, there is never a totality of what is seen, nor a unity of the points of view, except along the transversal that the frantic passenger traces from one window to the other, in order to draw together, in order to reweave intermittent and opposite fragments. This drawing together, this reweaving, is what Joyce called re-embodying. The body without organs is produced as a whole, but in its own particular place within the process of production, alongside the parts that it neither unifies nor totalizes. And when it operates on them, when it turns back upon them, se rabat sur elle, it brings about transverse communications, transfinite summarizations, polyvocal and transcursive inscriptions on its own surface, on which the functional breaks of partial objects are continually intersected by breaks in the signifying chains, and by breaks effected by a subject that uses them as reference points in order to locate itself. The whole not only coexists with all the parts, it is contiguous to them. It exists as a product that is produced apart from them, and yet at the same time is related to them. Geneticists have noted the same phenomenon in the particular language of their science. Amino acids are assimilated individually into the cell and then are arranged in the proper sequence by a mechanism analogous to a template onto which the distinctive side chain of each acid keys into its proper position. As a general rule, the problem of the relationships between parts and the whole continues to be rather awkwardly formulated by classic mechanism and vitalism, so long as the whole is considered as a totality derived from its parts, or as an original totality from which the parts emanate, or as a dialectical totalization. Neither mechanism nor vitalism has really understood the nature of desiring machines, nor the twofold need to consider the role of production in desire and the role of desire in mechanics. There is no sort of evolution of drives that would cause these drives and their objects to progress in the direction of an integrated whole, any more than there is an original totality from which they can be derived. Melanie Klein was responsible for the marvelous discovery of partial objects, that world of explosions, rotations, vibrations. But how can we explain the fact that she has nonetheless failed to grasp the logic of these objects? It is doubtless because, first of all, she conceives of them as fantasies and judges them from the point of view of consumption, rather than regarding them as genuine production. She explains them in terms of causal mechanisms, introjection and projection, for instance, of mechanisms that produce certain effects, gratification and frustration, and of mechanisms of expression, good or bad, an approach that forces her to adopt an idealist conception of the partial object. She does not relate these partial objects to a real process of production of the sort carried out by desiring machines, for instance. In the second place, she cannot rid herself of the notion that schizo-paranoid partial objects are related to a whole, either to an original whole that has existed earlier in a primary phase, or to a whole that will eventually appear in a final depressive stage, the complete object. Partial objects hence appear to her to be derived from, prélevés sur, global persons. Not only are they destined to play a role in totalities aimed at integrating the ego, the object, and drives later in life, but they also constitute the original type of object relation between the ego, the mother, and the father. And in the final analysis, that is where the crux of the matter lies. Partial objects unquestionably have a sufficient charge in and of themselves to blow up all of Oedipus and totally demolish its ridiculous claim to represent the unconscious, to triangulate the unconscious, to encompass the entire production of desire. The question that thus arises here is not at all that of the relative importance of what might be called the pre-Oedipal in relation to Oedipus itself, since pre-Oedipal still has a developmental or structural relationship to Oedipus. The question, rather, is that of the absolutely an-Oedipal nature of the production of desire. But because Melanie Klein insists on considering desire from the point of view of the whole, of global persons, and of complete objects, and also perhaps because she is eager to avoid any sort of contretemps with the International Psychoanalytic Association that bears above its door the inscription, "Let no one enter here who does not believe in Oedipus," she does not make use of partial objects to shatter the iron collar of Oedipus. On the contrary, she uses them, or makes a pretense of using them, to water Oedipus down, to miniaturize it, to find it everywhere, to extend it to the very earliest years of life. If we here choose the example of the analyst least prone to see everything in terms of Oedipus, we do so only in order to demonstrate what a forcing was necessary for her to make Oedipus the sole measure of desiring production. And naturally, this is all the more true in the case of run-of-the-mill practitioners who no longer have the slightest notion of what the psychoanalytic movement is all about. It is no longer a question of suggestion, but of sheer terrorism. Melanie Klein herself writes, "The first time Dick came to me, he manifested no sort of affect when his nurse handed him over to me. When I showed him the toys I had put ready, he looked at them without the faintest interest. I took a big train and put it beside a smaller one and called them Daddy Train and Dick Train. Thereupon he picked up the train I called Dick and made it roll to the window and said, 'Station.' I explained, 'The station is Mummy. Dick is going into Mummy.' He left the train, ran into the space between the outer and inner doors of the room, shutting himself in, saying, 'Dark,' and ran out again directly. He went through this performance several times. I explained to him, 'It is dark inside Mummy. Dick is inside dark Mummy.' Meantime, he picked up the train again, but soon ran back into the space between the doors. While I was saying that he was going into dark Mummy, he said twice, in a questioning way, 'Nurse.' As his analysis progressed, Dick had also discovered the wash basin as symbolizing the mother's body, and he displayed an extraordinary dread of being wetted with water. Say that it's Oedipus, or you'll get a slap in the face. The psychoanalyst no longer says to the patient, 'Tell me a little about your desiring machines, won't you?' Instead he screams, 'Answer Daddy and Mummy when I speak to you.' Even Melanie Klein. So the entire process of desiring production is trampled underfoot and reduced to, rabuté sur, parental images, laid out step by step in accordance with supposed pre-Oedipal stages, totalized in Oedipus, and the logic of partial objects is thereby reduced to nothing. Oedipus thus becomes, at this point, the crucial premise in the logic of psychoanalysis. For as we suspected at the very beginning, partial objects are only apparently derived from, prélevés sur, global persons. They are really produced by being drawn from, prélevés sur, a flow or a non-personal heil, with which they re-establish contact by connecting themselves to other partial objects. The unconscious is totally unaware of persons as such. Partial objects are not representations of parental figures or of the basic patterns of family relations. They are parts of desiring machines, having to do with a process and with relations of production that are both irreducible and prior to anything that may be made to conform to the Oedipal figure. When the break between Freud and Jung is discussed, the modest and practical point of disagreement that marked the beginning of their differences is too often forgotten. Jung remarked that in the process of transference, the psychoanalyst frequently appeared in the guise of a devil, a god, or a sorcerer, and that the roles he assumed in the patient's eyes went far beyond any sort of parental images. They eventually came to a total parting of the ways, yet Jung's initial reservation was a telling one. The same remark holds true of children's games. A child never confines himself to playing house, to playing only at being daddy and mummy. He also plays at being a magician, a cowboy, a cop, or a robber, a train, a little car. The train is not necessarily daddy, nor is the train station necessarily mummy. The problem has to do not with the sexual nature of desiring machines, but with the family nature of the sexuality. Admittedly, once the child has grown up, he finds himself deeply involved in social relations that are no longer familial relations. But since these relations supposedly come into being at a later stage in life, there are only two possible ways in which this can be explained. It must be granted either that sexuality is sublimated or neutralized in and through social and metaphysical relations, in the form of an analytic afterward, or else that these relations bring into play a non-sexual energy, for which sexuality has merely served as the symbol of an anagogical beyond. It was their disagreement on this particular point that eventually made the break between Freud and Jung irreconcilable. Yet at the same time, the two of them continued to share the belief that the libido cannot invest a social or metaphysical field without some sort of mediation. This is not the case, however. Let us consider a child at play, or a child crawling about exploring the various rooms of the house he lives in. He looks intently at an electrical outlet. He moves his body about like a machine. He uses one of his legs as though it were an oar. He goes into the kitchen, into the study. He runs toy cars back and forth. It is obvious that his parents are present all this time, and that the child would have nothing were it not for them. But that is not the real matter at issue. The matter at issue is to find out whether everything he touches is experienced as a representative of his parents. Ever since birth, his crib, his mother's breast, her nipple, his bowel movements are desiring machines connected to parts of his body. It seems to us self-contradictory to maintain, on the one hand, that the child lives among partial objects, and that on the other hand he conceives of these partial objects as being his parents, or even different parts of his parents' bodies. Strictly speaking, it is not true that a baby experiences his mother's breast as a separate part of her body. It exists rather as a part of a desiring machine connected to the baby's mouth, and is experienced as an object providing a non-personal flow of milk, be it copious or scanty. A desiring machine and a partial object do not represent anything. A partial object is not representative, even though it admittedly serves as a basis of relations and as a means of assigning agents a place and a function. But these agents are not persons any more than these relations are intersubjective. They are relations of production as such, and agents of production and anti-production. Ray Bradbury demonstrates this very well when he describes the nursery as a place where desiring production and group fantasy occur, as a place where the only connection is that between partial objects and agents. The small child lives with his family around the clock, but within the bosom of this family, and from the very first days of his life, he immediately begins having an amazing non-familial experience that psychoanalysis has completely failed to take into account. Lindner's painting attracts our attention once again. It is not a question of denying the vital importance of parents or the love attachment of children to their mothers and fathers. It is a question of knowing what the place and the function of parents are within desiring production, rather than doing the opposite, and forcing the entire interplay of desiring machines to fit within rabattre tous les jeux des machines désirant donc the restricted code of Oedipus. How does the child first come to define the places and the functions that the parents are going to occupy as special agents, closely related to other agents? From the beginning, Oedipus exists in one form and one form only, open in all directions to a social field, to a field of production directly invested by libido. It would seem obvious that parents indeed make their appearance on the recording surface of desiring production, but this is in fact the crux of the entire Oedipal problem. What are the precise forces that cause the Oedipal triangulation to close up? Under what conditions does this triangulation divert desire so that it flows across a surface within a narrow channel that is not a natural conformation of this surface? How does it form a type of inscription for experiences and the workings of mechanisms that extend far beyond it in every direction? It is in this sense, and this sense only, that the child relates the breast as a partial object to the person of his mother, and constantly watches the expression on his mother's face. The word relate in this case does not designate a natural productive relationship, but rather a relation in the sense of a report or an account, an inscription within the overall process of inscription within the noumen. From his very earliest infancy, the child has a wide-ranging life of desire, a whole set of non-familial relations with the objects and the machines of desire that is not related to the parents from the point of view of immediate production, but that is ascribed to them, with either love or hatred, from the point of view of the recording of the process, and in accordance with the very special conditions of this recording, including the effect of these conditions upon the process itself, feedback. It is amid partial objects, and within the non-familial relations of desiring production, that the child lives his life and ponders what it means to live, even though the question must be related to his parents, and the only possible tentative answer must be sought in family relations. I remember that ever since I was 8 years old, and even before that, I always wondered who I was, what I was, and why I was alive. I remember that at the age of 6, on a house on the Boulevard de la Blancard in Marseille, number 29 to be precise, just as I was eating my afternoon snack, a chocolate bar that a certain woman, known as my mother, gave me, I asked myself what it meant to exist, to be alive, what it meant to be conscious of oneself breathing, and I remember that I wanted to inhale myself in order to prove that I was alive and to see if I liked being alive, and if so, why. That is the crucial point. A question occurs to the child that will perhaps be related to the woman known as Mummy, but that is not formulated in terms of her, but rather produced within the interplay of desiring machines, at the level, for example, of the mouth-air machine or the tasting machine. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to breathe? What am I? What sort of thing is this breathing machine on my body without organs? The child is a metaphysical being. As in the case of the Cartesian cogito, parents have nothing to do with these questions. And we are guilty of an error when we confuse the fact that this question is related to the parents in the sense of being recounted or communicated to them, with the notion that it is related to them in the sense of a fundamental connection with them. By boxing the life of the child up within the Oedipus complex, by making familial relations the universal mediation of childhood, we cannot help but fail to understand the production of the unconscious itself and the collective mechanisms that have an immediate bearing on the unconscious. In particular, the entire interplay between primal psychic repression, the desiring machines, and the body without organs. For the unconscious is an orphan and produces itself within the identity of nature and man. The auto-production of the unconscious suddenly becomes evident when the subject of the Cartesian cogito realized that it had no parents, when the socialist thinker discovered the unity of man and nature within the process of production, and when the cycle discovers its independence from an indefinite parental regression. To quote Artaud once again, I got no papa mummy. We have seen how a confusion arose between the two meanings of process as the metaphysical production of the demoniacal within nature, and process as social production of desiring machines within history. Neither social relations nor metaphysical relations constitute an afterward or a beyond. The role of such relations must be recognized in all psychopathological processes, and their importance will be all the greater when we are dealing with psychotic syndromes that would appear to be the most animal-like and the most desocialized. It is in the child's very first days of life, in the most elementary behavior patterns of the suckling babe, that these relations with partial objects, with the agents of production, with the factors of anti-production, are woven in accordance with the laws of desiring production as a whole. By failing from the beginning to see what the precise nature of this desiring production is, and how, under what conditions, and in response to what pressures, the Oedipal triangulation plays a role in the recording of this process, we find ourselves trapped in the net of a diffuse, generalized Oedipalism that radically distorts the life of the child and his later development, the neurotic and psychotic problems of the adult, and sexuality as a whole. Let us keep D.H. Lawrence's reaction to psychoanalysis in mind and never forget it. In Lawrence's case, at least, his reservations with regard to psychoanalysis did not stem from terror at having discovered what real sexuality was, but he had the impression, the purely instinctive impression, that psychoanalysis was shutting sexuality up in a bizarre sort of box painted with bourgeois motifs, in a kind of rather repugnant artificial triangle, thereby stifling the whole of sexuality as production of desire, so as to recast it along entirely different lines, making of it a dirty little secret, the dirty little family secret, a private theatre rather than the fantastic factory of nature and production. Lawrence had the impression that sexuality possessed more power or more potentiality than that. And though psychoanalysis may perhaps have managed to disinfect the dirty little secret, the dreary dirty little secret of Oedipus the modern tyrant benefited very little from having been thus disinfected. Is it possible that, by taking the path that it has, psychoanalysis is reviving an age-old tendency to humble us, to demean us, and to make us feel guilty? Foucault has noted that the relationship between madness and the family can be traced back in large part to a development that affected the whole of bourgeois society in the 19th century. The family was entrusted with functions that became the measuring rod of the responsibility of its members and their possible guilt. Insofar as psychoanalysis cloaks insanity in the mantle of a parental complex, and regards the patterns of self-punishment resulting from Oedipus as a confession of guilt, its theories are not at all radical or innovative. On the contrary, it is completing the task begun by 19th century psychology, namely to develop a moralized familial discourse of mental pathology, linking madness to the half-real, half-imaginary dialectic of the family, deciphering within it the unending attempt to murder the father, the dull thud of instincts hammering at the solidity of the family as an institution and at its most archaic symbols. Hence, instead of participating in an undertaking that will bring about genuine liberation, psychoanalysis is taking part in the work of bourgeois repression at its most far-reaching level. That is to say, keeping European humanity harnessed to the yoke of daddy-mummy and making no effort to do away with this problem once and for all.